All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Charlotte Trowbridge and I work for the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. We are one of your hosts tonight, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our last Soil School session. We've had a series of presentations all month, so hopefully you've been able to join us at some previous presentations, and if you've missed them but want to see them, we are going to have them posted on our YouTube channel. So I'll make sure to remind everybody of that at the end. If you are not familiar with conservation districts, we are a local unit of government that exists in almost every county across the country, and we exist to be helping residents with a variety of natural resource concerns. So the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District operates in Washington County, Oregon, and the West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District operates in the western part of Multnomah County. So we are neighboring districts, and we team up each year to put on Soil School together. So the Tualatin SWCD, our mission is to create sustainable, productive, and healthy environment in the Washington County community. And we serve residents of the county by providing educational opportunities like this one, providing advice about natural resource conservation, and providing financial assistance for conservation projects. Then our partners, West Multnomah, have a very similar mission. They are aiming to provide resources, information, and expertise to inspire people to actively improve air and water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, and soil health. They serve residents of Western Multnomah County, Sauvie Island, and a portion of the Bonnie Slope neighborhood. So a few housekeeping items for you. I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A box while Amy gives her presentation tonight. So we're going to hold all the questions till the end, but you're welcome to submit them as we're going along because they'll just sit there in the Q&A box until the end. The chat, you can use that if you're having any logistical issues that need to be addressed or if you just want to say hi, but any of the questions, throw them in that Q&A box. So Amy will go ahead with her presentation until 6:50, and then we'll have 10 minutes for the Q&A. And so with that, I am pleased to introduce our presenter today. Amy Whitworth is lead designer and owner of Planet Earth Design in Southeast Portland. For 20 years and counting, Amy has been helping her clients craft earth-friendly gardens and deepen their connection with the natural world. She has received numerous awards for her educational and habitat gardens and has received Best of House awards for both design and customer service for 5 years in a row. Her background combines horticulture and fine arts. She teaches naturescaping, native plants, and rain garden classes for East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, and she presents on various sustainable design topics to homeowners, gardeners, and professionals alike. And we always love having Amy's expertise. So we were really glad that she was available to present at Soil School this year. So Amy, I'm going to turn it over to you, and the participants who are with us, go ahead and use that chat box if you have any logistical issues, or use the Q&A box for questions that you'd like Amy to address at the end. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Charlotte, and welcome everybody to the last section of Soil School. We're going to be talking about carbon farming at home, basically gardening, and how we can help do our part to help store carbon in the soil, because it's all about the soil. So we're going to start with the bad news first. So why do we care? Well, we're in the middle of a climate crisis. We have just overused our resources. We have pulled way too much carbon from underground, and we've used it, and it's exploding into the atmosphere. That has affected climate and weather and increased the amount of drought, leading to wildfires, and also causing acidification of oceans and then excessive logging, leading to less storing of carbon and processing of carbon. So it's a bad problem, and we're really past time to start thinking about it. We need to be taking action. And all of that is the glaciers are melting, the permafrost is thawing, oceans are rising, we're losing topsoil at a tremendous level and have been for decades. Acidification of our oceans. What's a person to do? It's too much. So you know, the answer is to do what we can, to take our little steps on our little slice of land to help to make the planet a little bit better and to store carbon as we can on our own properties. And I'm really going to be talking mostly about the garden, a little bit about farming, but mostly the home garden. So we'll start with a little bit about the carbon cycle. And basically the carbon cycle, carbon as being the basic building block of all life on the planet. And so there's all these carbon atoms that are floating around in the atmosphere, cycling through organisms on the planet. A lot of it going into the ocean because the ocean, the largest percentage of the earth is water. And so a lot of carbon is going deep into the ocean. And then the rest of it is going into land. It's being brought out of the earth through fossil fuels and emitted into the air, going back down into the plants through photosynthesis and all the natural products just cycling through, and respiration of plants and soil and animals as well is going back into the atmosphere. So it's a big loop, but we're pretty much out of balance. So more of the carbon that goes to the ground, 4%, 4 times more carbon is stored in the soil than is stored in the vegetation above the ground. So we really can do something to store carbon in our soils, and to really that carbon that goes into the soil can be stored for hundreds, if not thousands of years in a stable form. The word sustainability has been thrown around for decades now, and really we need to switch that mindset from sustainability, meaning that we're continuing as is and sustaining what's currently going on, to a mindset of a regenerative system where we're repairing and rebuilding and increasing our productivity and our ability to heal the planet. So a lot of this, way back when, there was still with us, Dr. Alan Savory from Zimbabwe, South Africa, who started a movement to regenerate the soil. He studied desertification in Africa and the things that caused that and how to possibly reduce that. And he developed the idea of holistic land management. And that idea was kind of taken and modified to become regenerative agriculture, which is a lot, it's a rebuilding because it's regenerative. So the farming methods that conventionally have been used have really destroyed a large percentage, 30 to 50% of the soil carbon because of all the turning over of that soil. And now there's a new way to kind of manage soils and plants together to build carbon in the soil. And a lot of that has to do with reducing soil disturbance. So we're talking about no-tilling methods, which we've been hearing about all throughout soil school, preventing erosion wherever we can. When we're not tilling, we're layering organics on top of the soil. All of that plant matter stays on the surface, and leaving living roots when we cut down plants, leaving them slowly to decompose and to reduce compaction in our soils. And a large part of that is cover crops. Cover crops have been used again for years, but we have changed some thinking about the way we might cover crop. And some of those latest ideas include a cover crop cocktail of different types of plants that function together and work to help heal the soil with a lot of that living roots so that they're keeping covered earth over the seasons when plants aren't growing, and then providing green manures after harvest. And as I said, we're going to talk more about gardening than farming here today, but and the difference being that we're really not tilling when we're gardening in our home gardens, where the plants are more permanent. We are disrupting the soil a lot less than we would be unless we're moving plants around. Basically, we're creating a more stable ecosystem, and that gives us the opportunity to build more carbon in our soils. One really good thing that we can do to help store carbon is to plant trees. So trees, being one of the largest types of plants, stores tons of carbon in its trunks, in its woody trunks. But all woody plants, even smaller woody plants, but the larger the plant, the more carbon is stored in the wood itself, but also in the roots and its interaction with the soil below, as we'll talk about. Also hedgerows to increase biodiversity and to also help cover the soil and improve habitat for our plants, for our animals, and other wildlife. So it's all about the living soil and the soil food web. And we are talking about the way that plants and the microbiology in the soil and the biology in the soil work together to actually build carbon and to hold it in the soil for long periods of time. And one good way to think about your soil would be to think about it as a living soil sponge. So we think about a sponge that's got lots of pores in it. It holds a lot of water. It also releases water slowly. It gets saturated and slowly releases water. So we should think of our properties as its own watershed. So that means that all the water that falls on our property should stay on our property, and we should create contours in such a way that the water can move around and slowly soak in when it's feasible. Certain very steep properties might not be appropriate to do something like that, but for other slightly sloped properties or flat properties, to slow it, absorb it, and store it, and also celebrate it. We get a lot of it. So in terms of the healthy living soil sponge, when we have compacted soils, we have lost the pore space. So there's no air, there's no water exchange. Those soils are devoid of life, and those soils without structure actually resist water. So we get puddling, we get impermeable soils, and flooding, basically. So there's a nice acronym to think about healthy soils, and that is OWL, which is oxygen, water, and life, which are the keys to creating pore space in the soil sponge and the key to healthy soils. And good tilth. And when we talk about tilth, we are referring to the physical qualities of soil, both the texture of soil, meaning the silt, sand, and clay content of the soil, but also the texture of the soil, which is the aggregates and crumbliness of the soil. So aggregates are important. They are what give it that crumbly character, and that's how we know we have soil that's working well. Besides what's happening on the surface, and we know we aren't getting puddles and things. Plants are growing well and soil is moving through the land. And yes, plants, we farm plants and the plants farm carbon. So they are building chains. All these microorganisms are building chains of carbon And the longer the chain of carbon, the more carbon is stored in the soil for a longer period of time, as long as they're not disrupted. And the roots are super important because they take all of that energy from the sun through photosynthesis and create all of these sugars, carbon sugars and carbohydrates that are used to build up the leaves and the roots of the plant. And down in that root zone or rhizosphere is a lot of that extra carbon sugars are leaking out through the roots, and they're attracting different bacteria and fungi towards the roots, and they are trading that carbon sugar for nutrients that the plant needs. So it's a really good collaboration and interaction and sharing of resources. So this little leakage of sugars, and everybody likes sugar, so it attracts all of these microorganisms who gather around and try to figure out what the plant needs through however they do that communication, and share resources, because of course trees can't walk over somewhere else to get what it is that they need. They need their microbiological helpers to bring it to them. One of the ways that that happens is through the fungal networks. And the mycelium and mycorrhizae, they have little exudates themselves. So they, through their little fungal networks, they exude little sticky substances called glomalin, and that stuff helps those aggregates stick together. It's also, they're also the highway, the information network, the conduit by which plants are receiving nutrition from other places besides where their own root zones are. Mushrooms are an indicator of good soil health, and scientists believe that there's more carbon stored in the mycorrhizal network than any other place in the soil. So as opposed to tilling, nature's way would be to have earthworms and invertebrates, microinvertebrates, and biology helping to turn the soil to create these aggregates. And the living roots of the plants, they're creating tunnels through the soil, they're dying, leaving behind organic matter that activates some of that soil biology. And that biology then interacts with the plants to help them grow better. Those tunnels also provide little pathways for water to make it deeper into the soil column, preserving more water for later in the season when the soils become so dry in our summers. And Dr. Elaine Ingham had coined the phrase, the soil food web, which we're all familiar with at this point. But basically all of these network of insects, biology, creatures under the ground, microscopic and non, but especially the microscopic ones, they are living their lives, eating one another as creatures do, and creating habitat for themselves. And they're gathering little bits of soil particles and atoms and building little homes for themselves. So they're creating little nooks and crannies where they can hide from predators and then pop out and eat somebody else. And they're pooping and they're recycling things, and they're starting to create soil structure. And that soil structure is particularly these aggregates that we've been talking about. And these aggregates together make up humus. And humus is mostly, is 60% carbon. And so that's where our carbon is stored in our soils, in these well-developed, dark, crumbly, lovely portions of soil that when things are working really well, has that kind of a texture. and improving the drainage, as we learned with the soil sponge, that when there are those pore spaces, that water can move through the soil more easily, more readily, and hold it for a longer period of time. Not that there won't ever be any puddling, but that's only when everything is just really saturated from the bottom up. And just to note that the biology is different depending on what types of plants are being grown. So the idea of succession from a disturbed area where there might have been construction, or a grassland, which is mostly a bacterially dominated soil, through perennials and small shrubs starting into larger shrubs and a little bit of trees, young trees, into a mature forest, which is a fungal dominated soil, and everything in between. And our home gardens tend to be in this middle area here, which is kind of a blend of bacteria and fungal resources, where we have trees and shrubs as well as grasses and ground covers, and all the different layers. And generally speaking, fungi, they respond to surface decomposition. So like the forest model, when leaves are dropping on the ground and decomposing, whereas bacteria prefer soil disturbance, as is the case with grasslands and animals moving through the grasslands. So what the kind of soil you're looking for depends on what it is that you're trying to do. Naturescaping in the Pacific Northwest is pretty much using the forest model, where we have a mixture of trees and shrubs and ground covers, moving towards a forest condition. Whereas meadowscaping mimics the Grasslands model and is a more bacterially dominated soil condition, really early succession. And that would be similar to what our lawns are. So lawn, a good way to improve the water holding capacity and the soil benefits of a lawn would be to use something like a ecology lawn, or a lawn blend that includes clover and flowers and grass and different kinds of plants growing together. That makes for deeper roots and ultimately healthier soil. But even with a regular conventional lawn, mowing less frequently will allow those green leaves to gather food for a longer period of time, so they can feed that to the microbes below the soil, and make for healthier roots, deeper roots, and again, a healthier soil. And back to relating this to the holistic land management idea, which a key portion of that way of thinking is keeping animals on the land, or generally speaking about cows when we talk about that. But in the home garden, chickens, goats, smaller animals that are suitable for urban living or small properties, they will do a small job of helping to cultivate the soil and, of course, generating manure, which then you can compost and add back to the soil, providing food for you depending on what it is that they're doing, but also reducing food waste, because you're going to be feeding them some excess food scraps that you might have as you move through your day. And now talking about some soil practices, we'll start with the idea of removing lawn, which is the smothering the lawn with basically an active compost on top of the soil. So you're covering the lawn with cardboard or newspaper, and then layering different materials in kind of a brown to green progression, from wood chips and chopped leaves to some soil and compost and manure and garden trimmings and lawn clippings, all in kitchen scraps, things like that, that are all going to be kind of layered in there. And when you do that kind of layering, you're making a much more active compost pile. And so it's going to cook down more quickly. A lot of us use wood chips from chip drop to help to jumpstart or to kill our lawn, to smother the lawn in the first place. A really nice way to work with nature so that you don't have to do all that digging out of sod. And I like to tell people that, you know, the summer chips, the chips that you get from the arborist in the summertime, are going to cook down a lot more quickly than they will when you get them in the fall. Fall is generally the recommended time to do this because we're heading into the rainy season, and the two magic elements of this whole process is time and water. So water is on our side. We're going into the rainy season, so it's going to help those elements to break down. But with summer chips, you're getting the wood product, the carbon wood product, also mixed with the green leaves, all chopped up together. So you're basically getting this lasagna type of mix. And usually by the time they dump it, it's already steaming because it's so full of microbial activity. So the downside to this whole lasagna method is that it takes time and you need patience, which we tend to not be so good at. So I think a question that a lot of people have with this whole no-till thing, and how do you get started because you have this really bad compacted soil, and how are you going to get this stuff, all your soil amendments in there? Well, you might need to do some remediation and turn that soil just to get started. So the problem is tilling constantly over and over the same field at the same depth many years in a row. Turning the soil one time, if it's really compacted and in poor shape and not really supporting much plant life, then you need to get some air into that fairly quickly. So maybe the best way to do that is to kind of turn that soil just to get started. You can still sheet mulch or do the lasagna method over that simple turning of the soil. A couple of ways to go about that would be to use a core aerator, which we use for lawns, to kind of pull out these cores, and or use a soil auger with a long, like 18-inch bit, and drill holes into the ground and fill those holes with worm castings or compost tea or just any kind of compost to help jumpstart some biology in the soil. And another way would be to use either a broad fork or a shovel, which is still disruptive, but slightly less disruptive than tilling the soil. So we're seeing a guy here with a broad fork, which you basically stick into the ground and rock back and forth, and it breaks through the soil, not really turning it over, but just kind of makes it, just kind of loosens a big clod of it at a time. So you can get out some weeds and just kind of open up that soil for the addition of compost. So when we think about what we're going to put in the ground, one thing that's been that we've been talking about a lot lately, and we had just a nice presentation on at Soil School, is this idea of biochar, which is a basically burned organic material that is burned in a low oxygen environment. And so it's very porous, and it provides a lot of habitat for soil microbes. And because it is porous, it improves water movement through the soil. Other things that we can use to amend the soil would be a compost or a planting mix, either purchased or homemade. Another idea is something like composted seaweed or liquid seaweed. And that's because since there is so many minerals in the ocean, which we don't really get on the land, using seaweed, and we're talking about dead seaweed that's washed up on the beach type seaweed, that can be collected and rinsed so that it's not quite so salty, and either composted or broken up and laid on the soil for it to break down over the winter, and releasing lots of high quality minerals and micronutrients that the plants might not otherwise get. Another great soil amendment is composted manure from animals with generally a high fungal content, good for forest systems and woody plants. And then compost tea, which is a sprayed on application that can either be used as a foliar feed on plants themselves or really just watered into the soil to help activate that biology. And really simply, making compost is a great way to jumpstart the biology on your land, and also take advantage of all of those materials that are cycling through. You might not like the idea or the look of lots of dead leaves and decaying material all over your yard. And so one good way to take care of that is to collect it up and compost it all together. And models have shown that if the world just switched to composting and not putting green materials in the garbage in landfills, that it could potentially save 2.3 billion tons of methane over the course of 30 years. So that's a lot. And so this is a simple thing that you can do to just kind of help reduce the amount of methane. Of course, here in the city of Portland and in other surrounding areas as well, we have yard debris bins where they're doing composting on a large scale. But for those places that are not doing that, then all of the green material is really just going into the garbage, into the landfill, where it does produce methane over time because there's no oxygen. So another really important, basically we've been talking this whole time about avoiding compaction being the enemy, and preserving that porous soil structure and preserving the permeability of soils. And we're looking at a rain garden here where that water is just staying on site and soaking into the ground day after day throughout the winter. And also to remember to never work overly wet or overly dry soils. So when we're talking about working, we're talking about trying to mix in amendments when the soil is saturated or bone dry, or even just doing planting at that time of year. And that's when the soil is really mucky, you're sinking into clay soils. You can just see that it's sopping wet. It's muddy, it's slick, and it's much better to wait a couple of days until things dry out and the rain stops. Once the soil is not quite so soggy, then you can start working it again. Keeping heavy equipment off of our soils, and that's why after construction in residential areas, whether it be remodel or new construction in a section of the yard, there's been a lot of compaction just from people marching around, possible machinery. All of that is time for remediation, soil remediation. And then even in the garden ourselves, just our footfalls and walking through the garden can really compact soils pretty seriously. So it's a good idea to have some stepping stones through the garden, a path where it is that you walk, really staying off the garden beds and staying on the paths, or just hop through your garden through a series of stepping stones because you know where you walk. So it's better to stay on the paths. And then avoiding compaction reduces stormwater runoff. So even like a lawn, which is very green, a conventional lawn at least, will just act as if it's a hardscape and repel the water. The water will just sheet off of those lawn surface areas. So having a good absorbent soil with lots of pore spaces will help to reduce that stormwater runoff, and at the same time reducing erosion that is carried with the water when it leaves the site. Another thing to think about is to control surface water on a hillside by using creative uses of rocks and contouring and wood products, logs and sticks to control the movement of water through the hillside and kind of direct it back and forth across the contours of the hill. giving it time to soak in as it goes, and also creating healthy soil at that same time will help to absorb some of that water, or all of that water, hopefully, before it makes it out to the street. And then, of course, all of this doesn't work if you're still using chemicals on your property, and that includes Roundup, or maybe especially Roundup. But I think I mention it because a lot of people, you know, they don't use any chemicals, except they do have some Roundup now and then. So remember that a lot of these synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides are made from petroleum products themselves. Their manufacture also requires high fossil fuel input. And then it really breaks up that relationship between the plants and the soil, and the way that they share those resources that we talked about earlier, because the chemicals themselves, the fertilizers, are feeding the plant everything they need. So they have no reason to enlist the help of the soil microorganisms to give them the resources they need. They have everything they need in the fertilizers. So it really ends up fertilizing the plant, but reducing overall soil fertility over time. And so many good reasons to stop using chemicals. And always covering the soil. So with an organic mulch, the impact of sun and wind and heat and raindrops, all of that really destroy those soil aggregates. So it's very important to cover the soil with some sort of organic matter, whether it be wood chips or compost or straw or yard debris, anything really, just to make sure that that soil is covered, especially over the winter, but even in the summertime. And certainly there are times of the year where in the summertime, when things get really dry, if you haven't been watering and your soil isn't really perfect, your soil might start to crack, maybe not as badly as this, but maybe. And so at that point is a perfect time to add some compost on top of your soil to cover up all those cracks. And that compost just kind of works its way down deeper into the soil than it would if you just laid it on the top. And is a really great way, as soon as the rains come, it'll start to help that compost penetrate even more deeply. And then a living mulch, even better, because we've learned that the living roots have that relationship with the soil microorganisms. And so that living mulch, or otherwise known as ground covers, or a mix of low herbaceous plants or grasses, herbs, perennials, those types of plants, can be a nice, diverse, and lush way to cover the ground with a green mulch so that it doesn't dry out through the summer. And that can be either in the form of cover crops or diverse plantings. And there is some new thinking within planting design circles that is known as planting the matrix. And that matrix is basically thinking about planting not just the visual layer of what it is that you want to see, but actually thinking about what's the ground plane, what are the plants that are going to cover the ground first, and then layering in the plants that you're going to want to see, the perennials and the grasses that are short but showy, and then the larger woody shrubs having their own layers. So you're even thinking about designing in 3 dimensions. It's not just like this drawing, which is a flat plane of images, but you're actually thinking about how are you going to cover the ground completely as you plant. And the different canopy layers of the plants, the different heights of the plants, sizes of them, the types of them, woody plants and grasses, smaller plants, they all have different root depths. They all grow slightly differently. Those that colonize and spread through the soil layer the deep-rooted trees, all of those different depths of plants help to improve the soil structure and provide the nutrient variety that is needed for healthy soils. And we can use permaculture, the guild model, as a great idea for how that happens. So in this example, this is a peach tree guild, and starting with the tree or your largest plant, you're underplanting that tree with other supportive plants that have different roles to help symbiotically help that tree survive and to thrive. So you have your deep-rooted plants, which are kind of the bioaccumulator plants. They pull up nutrients from deep into the soil column. Plants like comfrey, that might be a mulcher type of a plant, is also deep-rooted, but it has lots of fleshy leaves, which can be cut down to the ground and harvested many times in the growing season. And they hold those nutrients in their leaves. So that's a great material to use for your lasagna method. It's also good to just lay down as a mulch over the soil, besides its medicinal values. And then we have the plant like strawberry, which is a ground cover or a weed suppressing mat. Are legumes or something like a red clover that is a nitrogen fixing plant. So that helps to provide nitrogen to the tree. And also plants like parsley and cilantro and cosmos that are pollinator attractors that will help to support local pollinators when the trees are not in bloom and keeping them going through the year. And also repellent plants like garlic that might keep pests away. So it's a lot like companion planting in a vegetable garden. This is kind of the model for the food forest or forest gardening, where you're thinking about not just what looks good and what goes where, although that's really important, but at the same time thinking about what is their interrelationship and how will they support one another. And it's also important to think about when it's time to harvest the plant, you need to step around underneath that tree to get the fruit. So you don't want plants that are going to be active in the late summer. You want them to kind of be pretty dormant by that time of year, so you can get in there to do the harvesting that you need. So you wouldn't put like a woody shrub underneath there if you're trying to harvest, and that's mostly for food production. But you can also just do it in a regular garden bed, and especially with natives, but any plant, to plant diversely and densely and help that soil ecology thrive, because you have all the soil covered and a mix of wonderful native plants. So nature loves that diversity, and to have plants all over the ground and also with their living roots, and keeping the leaves in place or for nutrient cycling throughout the winter, or taking them off in the winter and putting them back on, composting them and putting a mulch on for the winter and adding it back in at a later date. And then rethinking weeds. And this is controversial perhaps, but why are they there and what is it that they're doing? They're covering the soil. Weeds are an indication that there's either something lacking or that there's space to grow something else. So weeds are an indicator plant. A lot of our Northwest weeds, we grow a lot of clover here. And one of the reasons that clover really loves our clay soils is that our soils are pretty deficient of nitrogen. If they're deficient of anything, it's going to be of nitrogen. And so clover, being a nitrogen fixer, is in there healing the soil. So we keep pulling out the clover because it's a weed. Maybe we should rethink what we're doing with the clover. And maybe we should just be cutting it back so it doesn't reseed all over the place, and leaving those living roots in place doing their job. Just an idea. And hopefully this gave you some good ideas on how to be a good carbon farmer at home. and to help you build a good, healthy soil. And that pretty much wraps up what I have to share with you today. And I hope this has generated some thoughts for you and possibly some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. And yes, there is a good handful of questions, which I'm excited to go through. So Amy's going to keep this last slide up so that you can copy down her contact information if you'd like to. And just in case some people start dropping off as we go through questions, thank you for joining us. Like I mentioned, there are all of the Soil School presentation recordings are going to be on our YouTube channel. So you can visit the Tualatin SWCD website to get there or go straight to YouTube. This will be up there next week. So yeah, Amy, I'm going to start throwing some questions at you. I'm going to first start with two just kind of clarification ones, and then we can get into some meatier questions. One of them was, can you share the name of the professor that came up with the holistic land management idea?
Yeah, that's Dr. Alan Savory of the Savory Institute in Africa.
Great, thank you. And then the other one that was a comment, which is really helpful for everyone, is Scott shared one of the resources that Amy talked about, which is Chip Drop. So that's getchipdrop.com. And I'll actually go ahead and write that in the chat so that it stays visible to anyone who's interested in that resource. All right, so diving into the questions, can you define an aggregate? What does it look like? How big is it? Where is it hidden in the rest of the soil? How do I know when I have one in my site?
Yeah, there are many different kinds of aggregates. So aggregate is kind of a term that refers to, I mean, if you looked up soil aggregates, you'd see that they're varied and plentiful. That's just kind of naturally what happens when the biology gets going in the soil, between the little glues that hold things together and the little homes that they make for themselves. How do you know when you have one? Well, when you dig into the soil, it's not just a big clump that stays together and doesn't move at all. You can actually see pores in it. And it's crumbly, as opposed to maybe some heavy clay soils might be just kind of thick and sticky. Those would be not examples of aggregates. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems like a kind of abstract comment or concept until you're like holding it and feeling and understanding what it is.
Look for the pores, yeah.
Look for the pores, I like that. All right, our next question is, can you talk about tools for cutting down cover crops and, if appropriate, to incorporate our plants into the soil?
Not really. I'm not much of a farming expert, so I can't really, you know, the techniques that I use, I would not recommend other people use because they're probably more labor intensive, and I like to lovingly touch all my plants, so I can't really.
That is fair. And to the folks who are curious about that question, I would say you can reach out to the soil and water conservation districts. I'm not the expert in our district about it, so I can't answer it either, but we have staff who can provide guidance. So I encourage you to reach out. All right, the next question. What about using charred wood from the fire pit that didn't completely burn as an amendment as a DIY biochar?
Yeah, you can use it as a material in your soil. It is not biochar, and so it functions differently than biochar. Wood burns in the presence of oxygen, very much so, in your fire pit. Now we're kind of talking about wood ash and material that is not quite wood ash yet. But it's not harmful in the soil. The wood ash can add like a very sweetening quality to make the pH a little bit more limey, a lower number pH. So yeah, it could be used, but it isn't biochar. So it's not really a substitute, but it's not a bad thing. You know, ash is its own thing, but the burnt wood is fine in the ground.
Great, thank you. Do fertilizers like Miracle-Gro that are a form of salt and have the clear slippery granules, do those tend to kill the biology like table salt would?
I'm sorry, I was spacing out for a minute there. Try it
Yeah,
one more
I can
time.
repeat it. Sure. Do fertilizers like Miracle-Gro that are a form of salt tend to kill the biology like table salt would?
Well, they kill the biology because they are basically a chemical fertilizer, and that is the nature of the beast. I don't know that it's, I'm not really quite sure why. Maybe it's the salt, maybe it's not the salt, so I can't really speak to the salt part of the question. But I can speak to the fact that, you know, you want to be feeding the soil and not the plant, and Miracle-Gro is all about feeding the plant, so it doesn't need the soil. That's why, you know, you can grow these kinds of plants without soil. You can grow these kinds of plants in just water without any soil, because you're just adding the nutrients that it needs without the soil. So the idea with this, what we're talking about today, is not needing the Miracle-Gro because the soil is providing everything the plant needs.
Great, thank you. Is there a role for organic fertilizers in the vegetable garden if you have healthy soil?
Sure. Yeah, organics are not going to harm the microbes in the soil, and they might in fact activate them. So organic fertilizer is fine. It can't burn the plant. You might or might not need it, but it certainly isn't going to hurt anything. And it's, yeah, I mean, there's lots of people that add different elements of organic fertilizers into their compost pile just to make it more nutritious, and adding elements that might otherwise be missing. So yeah.
All right, what other common weeds are helpful to leave in compacted clay soils?
Yeah, clover is my best one. That was my best example. I don't know. Other weeds are good. I just, for those of you that aren't familiar, there's a great book called The Soil Will Save Us by Kristen Olson. And she makes soil science pretty easy, very easy to understand. So I'd encourage anybody to read it. It's a fun read. And anyway, she was a client of mine, and she was never weeding. And I was like, Chris, you gotta get rid of some of these weeds. It's just not right. She'd be out there with her scissors cutting all her weeds down because she wanted to leave the living roots in the soil. And I'm like, okay, all right, I understand. That means I haven't planted enough for you. Let's choose some other plants here for you. But I've learned a lot from her just because of that approach with the weeds, and what the weeds tell us is that, you know, we haven't planted enough, really.
All right, I'm wondering if your answer to this question is going to be the same as the one you just gave. So what is your favorite or most recommended cover crop?
Again, I'm not really a farmer, so cover crops are not really my thing, but the cocktail, I think, is the best way to go. For myself, I pretty much grow fava beans because I want to eat them. So that's not really what and they're a nitrogen fixer, so that's great. But I think really the healthier way to go is with a mix of cover crops, both grasses and legumes and other seeds together. And Chris, indeed, when she wrote the book, she got gifted some fabulous cover crop cocktail blends from Gabe Brown up in the Dakotas, and put them in her raised bed. And man, that was one beautiful bed of lush green cover crop that she could eat off of as well. It was kind of incredible. But I think, I don't know that they sell those cocktails. I think you kind of have to put them together yourself. So, but I can't really speak to that.
Great, and I would say that's another one where folks have follow-up questions about cover crops. Please do reach out to your Soil and Water Conservation District. That is the topic that we handle quite often. All right, we've got about 5 minutes, and you're doing a great job cruising through these questions. So the next one is there quantitative data on how much carbon can be sequestered per year in a typical garden? How much offset in a family's carbon footprint can come from good garden practices?
I think that is a little bit of an open question. I know they're working on that, and I did just run across, wasn't around here, but there was a citizen science project where they were recruiting homeowners to use different practices in their yard so they could actually measure this. I think that's something that lots of people are working on now, is to actually quantify that carbon. It's been a little bit mushy right now as far as how much is stored. They know that more is stored, but the quantity of it is, I think, yet to be determined, the exact quantities.
Yeah, that was a great question.
Yeah.
All right. What is the best time of year to aerate heavy clay soil?
When it's moist but not wet. So that would be either early fall or early spring. It really depends on the year and when, how much rain we've been having. So, right now it might be getting too dry already, but maybe, right after the rain might have been a good time. So it's really just kind of getting a shovel to the ground and seeing if you can get in there in the first place, and that it's not too mushy and you're not seeing too much water in there. You dig a hole and there's water at the bottom of the hole, then it's not a good time.
Great. All right, we've got 3 more questions, so we are going to go right up to 7.
Okay.
Does carbon stored in the soil include oil and coal?
Yes.
Great. All right. Can you buy microbes? Is there a list of what's good and what's bad? Same question for fungus, biofungicides, and whatever else.
There seems to be a lot of products on the market that are for that contain mycorrhizae, and I don't really know about those products, and I have my own questions about them. Dried microbes don't seem like such a great thing to me. I know they stay dormant for a while, but they don't have a forever lifetime while they're dormant. So yeah, I don't know if I can really answer that question.
Yeah, and for the folks who are interested in that question, I'd say, so last Thursday we had Jen Moore, who gave a presentation on soil microbes, and she welcomes people reaching out to her. So if you have some follow-up questions about microbes, getting her contact info would be good. All right, last one. In the canopy picture, how do the people keep out things like wild mustard, knapweed, perennial rye, and undesirable plants? That looks like something you could pick over every day, all day.
Again, I think, planting other things in their place so that they don't have the open soil to be able to establish themselves in the first place is kind of what we're talking about here. It's not like you're never going to get a weed. It's just that you need to just plant more of something else if you don't want it to be there, and more of a weed suppressing plant. Just keep trying different plants until you find one that kind of works for you.
Great. Well, Amy, you are amazing. You got through 15 questions before 7 o'clock. So thank you to everyone who is submitting questions. It's always so much more fun when we've got interaction like that. And Amy, thank you again for presenting at Soil School. So I hope everyone has a lovely evening, and hopefully next year we can all be having Soil School in person together. So thank you so much.
Here.
And yeah, we'll see you next year, hopefully.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.